Last time we spoke about the unleashing of Operation Postern and the continued advance towards Salamaua. Red Beach and Yellow Beach were secured with minimal Japanese aerial raids trying to hinder the movement of men and supplies. Defensive perimeters were quickly established and units began their drive towards Lae and Nadzab. Meanwhile, the offensive against Salamaua raged on while the Japanese commanders received the shocking news of the landings in the Lae area. General Adachi frantically ordered forces to withdraw from the Salamaua area to rush over to Lae's defenses. Meanwhile, Shogun Mukai took the little forces they had on hand to prepare a defense to the death to try and hold back the Allies from claiming their ultimate prize. But in the end, would it not result in the loss of both? This episode is The Fall of Lae and Salamaua. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I just released a historic film review on the Oppenheimer film. You could also check out my Patreon at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for exclusive podcasts. This month's podcast will be a special on Tomoyuki Yamashita and how he became the Tiger of Malaya. Check it out, it means a lot to me. So as we had left off last time, the landings were a success. The Australian 9th Division, transported by 5 destroyers, landed to the east of Lae on September the 4th. Aside from a few air raids from Rabaul, it went pretty much unopposed. As Admiral Barbie noted, unloading of LSTs, each containing 400 men, 35 vehicles, and 80 tons of bulk stores was excellent. One LST was unloaded in 1 hour and 42 minutes. Unloading of the remainder was completed within 2 hours and 15 minutes. By 10:30 a.m., 7,800 troops and 1,500 tons of stores were ashore. The 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment dropped at Nadzab, pushing small amounts of Japanese forces further north. And at Salamaua, General Milford's forces held down the bulk of the Japanese troops, who now were frantically trying to rush over to Lae. General Milford's 5th Division were applying an enormous amount of pressure upon the Salamaua defenses, trying to tie down the bulk of General Nakano's forces. Despite the frantic orders to withdraw over to Lae, the Salamaua defenders would continue to offer strong resistance against Milford's attacks, as they still wanted to retain Salamaua. North of the Francisco River, the Japanese had considerable artillery to support a defense and continued to fire upon the advancing attackers. In response at 5 a.m. on September the 5th, Captain Dawson's 2 and 6 Field Regiment directed their artillery concentration upon Rough Hill and Arnold's Crest. A patrol of the 58th, 59th, and the 2 and 7th Battalions tried to peek at both, and they were forced to pull back because of the heavy fire. During the afternoon, the 12th Platoon of Lieutenant Albert Farley's B Company attacked the Pimple, a prominent feature near the middle of what was being called E Ridge. It was a razorback that approached along the Lucano Ridge. It allowed no flanking maneuvers. The platoon was met with Australian grenades, and it seems the Japanese had stolen a bunch of these at some point to do so. During the night, a detachment of SNLF Marines performed a surprising counterattack. They began with a motor attack before creeping within 10 meters of the Australian lines. According to Keith Ross, the Japanese did not even have bullets in their gunspouts, believing someone might prematurely fire a shot, making the enemy aware of their presence. When they got within just 10 meters of the enemy, they began to cock their weapons. Ross recalled, "When they charged their magazines, they made a hell of a racket, and we realized that they were there. The Japanese charged with fixed bayonets and were met with a wall of fire, forcing them to quickly withdraw." Over on Charlie Hill, Companies 1 and 3 of the 66th Regiment, led by Lieutenant Usai Genkichi, were trapped. so they set up an ambush position to try and cut off the supply lines of A and B companies of the 42nd Battalion. As a ration train was moving around the western slopes of Charlie Hill to supply Greer's B Company, the Japanese fired upon them from a newly established position on a ledge. The next day, another ration train was hit 100 yards down the ridge to the west. This prompted Davidson to have the ration trains bypass the ambush areas more widely. Uzi then ordered his men to light fires that would burn towards the Australian positions. Using just wind, Uzi hoped to dislodge the Australians. On the 6th, the 12th Platoon maneuvered to cut off the Japanese supply line, but at 5 p.m. a Kune grass fire forced them out. Then the 10th Platoon rushed over to retake the position, but likewise was burned out. The following morning, another platoon came over, but the Japanese were already digging in. This little fire trick protected the Japanese from being completely cut off. It was a surprising victory for Usai, who worked to prevent the Allied supplies from getting through, forcing the assault upon Charlie Hill to a halt. Meanwhile, on September the 6th, General Nakano accompanied the 3rd Battalion 102nd Regiment with some SNLF Marines as they debarked Salamaua, aboard 73 barges en route to Lae. Over at Lae, General Shogi and Admiral Fujita were commanding the meager amount of combat forces that they had, alongside numerous inexperienced non-combatants, to try and halt the Allied advance. Nakano ordered his forces to commence their withdrawal towards Lae on September the 8th. He began by deploying the 1st Battalion 115th Regiment at Buang, near the coast north of Malolo, to cover the retreat. His forces south of the Francisco River were to pull back across the river, while 200 men of the 15th Independent Engineer Regiment would hold the line connecting Yalu and Markham Point. Against them, Brigadier Evans had established a supply point at G Beach, which was on the western mouth of the Burrup River. There he had set up the 24th Brigade's HQ and brought up two 25-pounder guns for support. This greatly lessened the supply line to the front. Meanwhile, Brigadier Whitehead's men were beginning to reach the east bank of the Busso River. General Wootton's 224th and 228th were advancing towards Busso as well. When Lieutenant Ed Shattuck's platoon of the 224th Battalion reached the Busso, Shattuck was ordered not to cross it, and he recalled, "The Japs were not in a position opposite me. We could have done it." In reality, his force had reached a point on the Busso that held an extremely fast current. Perhaps his best swimmers may have been able to ford it without clothes or equipment, but it would have been dangerous as hell, especially if the Japanese caught them on the other side. Whitehead was eager to cross it, but knew the danger, so he waited to bring bridging equipment over first. He also ordered the 2 and 4th Independent Company over in Burrup to advance west through some thick jungle to take a position east of the Busso. Over in the coastal area, Lieutenant Colonel Colin Norman's 228th Battalion reached the Busso in the afternoon. They noticed the 3rd Battalion 102nd Regiment was assembling at the Busso River line, along with remnants of the 3rd Battalion 115th Regiment led by Major Mukai. The river looked to be swollen from the recent heavy rains, thus the Japanese likewise needed to build a bridge to get across. Back over at Nadzab, the 871st Airborne Engineers continued their labor under terrible torrential rain, allowing the 2 and 33rd Battalion to arrive by September the 9th. This was the same battalion that had underwent the terrible accident when a B-24 Liberator crashed on takeoff after clipping a branch and rammed into 5 troop trucks full of soldiers waiting to debark. Its 4 500-pound bombs exploded, tossing 2,800 gallons of fuel in all directions, killing 59 and wounding 92. Thus, the weakened battalion alongside the 2 and 25th would begin an advance down the Markham Valley towards Lae. They were met with the traditional New Guinea welcome, torrential rain. Most of Nadzab's airstrip was so flooded it delayed the arrival of the 2 and 31st Battalion until September the 12th, much to General Vasey's dismay. Back over at Charlie Hill, the isolated Japanese were taking advantage of the torrential rain. They began evacuating pillboxes upon the knolls between Charlie Hill and Lewis Knoll. During the night of September the 8th, the whole of the Charlie, Lewis, Breger Hill area would be evacuated. At 9:30 a.m. the next day, a mortar barrage began as platoons crossed their start lines on the northern slopes of Charlie Hill. 15 minutes later, the 1st Platoon managed to occupy the first part of the Japanese perimeter without any opposition. The 2nd Platoon passed through them and occupied the rest of the perimeter. Charlie Hill was now in Australian hands. Wasting no time, Davidson ordered B Company, now under the command of Captain Ganter, to pursue the fleeing Japanese towards Nuknuk, which I had to say 3 times before not laughing. God, I love New Guinea. At the same time, the 47th Battalion also found abandoned pillboxes facing them, so they began a pursuit of the fleeing enemy. Colonel McKechnie's men found the same situation over at Berger Hill. On September the 9th, the 15th Battalion were carrying out a 2-pronged attack upon the crest of Scout Ridge. C Company came from the bamboos, while D Company performed an outflanking maneuver from the enemy's rear. Both forces had a limited approach area, allowing only a platoon front. At 2:40 p.m., the outflanking company's 4 platoon reached the crest of Scout Ridge, finding no opposition. At 3:35, they reached the southwest edge of the Japanese position, facing the bamboos, and alongside the other company's platoons, they began an attack. The enemy fired green flares and withdrew upon seeing them, leading to only a minor skirmish. Over on Lae Ridge, Lieutenant Turner was leading a platoon assault under artillery and motor support. They attacked the last Japanese strongpoint on its eastern tip, overlooking the sea. The Japanese had hastily evacuated the position, fleeing into the jungle below, leaving many dead and abandoned a ton of equipment. Further patrols coming from the bamboos completed what was becoming a relieving picture. The pimple and the knoll on Lae Ridge were abandoned. After a 10-day initiation in the battle area, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Ames, the commander of the 15th Battalion, signaled Milford late on September the 9th, "The 15th now holds a line of Lae Ridge complete from C at Lucano to the crest of Scout Ridge." All of the brigadiers met on the 9th with Milford, who ordered them to speed up the division's advance so that they could give the enemy no respite to reorganize or occupy new positions. And thus the race was on to Salamaua. Brigadiers Hammer and Monaghan began a competition to see who would reach Salamaua first. Hammer would state that Monaghan had come in at the death knock, and Monaghan replied to this, that Hammer could relax and leave the battle to the 29th Brigade, who would clean it up for you. Meanwhile, General Wooden's men were preparing to cross the Busu. During the morning, their patrols had gone across to find suitable crossing points, but they found none. Over at the coast, one patrol reached a large island named Rook's Island, as Lieutenant Rook led the patrol. The island was in the center of the Busu's mouth. Colonel Norman ordered Captain Leo Leon's A Company to attempt a crossing. They sent 1 platoon across via a sandbank at the mouth, while the remainder of the company covered them with fire from Rook's Island. Captain Leo Leon watched as 2 leading scouts moved across the sandbar about 50 meters apart with their rifles over their heads. The lead scout got about 80 meters from the far bank when the Japanese began opening fire from around the mouth area of the river. Both men fell, and they were washed out to sea, but one was only wounded and managed to fight his way back across the current to the Allied side. Worried by the delays, Wooden ordered his brigadiers to seize some bridgeheads over the Busu. Norman assembled his battalion on the east bank near Rook's Island and crossed the last channel of the Busu in 4 extended lines by the late afternoon. After stealthily fording over to Rook's Island, the 2 and 28th began crossing the channel under the cover of 25-pounder fire at about 5:30 p.m. Each company moved to the start line one after another at 2-minute intervals. It was a very difficult crossing. Many were swept off their feet by the fierce current. Many had their weapons snatched right from them. As men began to be swept off, they tried grasping for anything they could on the western bank, like overhanging boughs or kunai grass. This shocked the Japanese. They had not considered it a possibility to cross there. Most of the Japanese machine guns and grenade launchers were at the mouth point tip, and thus they began to scramble to try and hit the Allies now fording the channel, but it was too late. Norman's men lost apparently 25% of their weapons crossing and suffered 13 deaths, but they gained Wooten's desired bridgehead. On September the 9th, at the height of the battle, Admiral Mori arrived at Lae via the I-174. He relieved Admiral Fujita, who would return to rebel on the same submarine. He soon discovered most of the naval forces were allocated to support tasks, while Nakano directed the IGA forces to man the main defenses of Lae. The 2nd Machine Gun Company of the 238th Regiment and the 25th Machine Cannon Company were sent to Munum. and Nagasawampum to keep the road open to Bona. Back over at Norman's bridgehead, some Japanese units crept through some kunai grass to surprise attack them using machine gun and mortar fire. But it was all for naught, as Norman's C Company counterattacked with fixed bayonets charging into waist-deep swamp water where the Japanese were hiding. B Company came in to support them, and gradually the Japanese scattered after 63 deaths while the Australians suffered 21 casualties. Feeling more confident, Evans had the 2 and 43rd Battalion hand over their weapons to be ferried across over to the 2 and 28th. A LCVP was able to make 40 trips, taking some 1,200 troops and much supplies over to the west bank of the Busu. To the north, Whitehead's 26th Brigade had been delayed for 36 hours, waiting for some rubber boats and suitable rope to get their men across. The 2 and 24th Battalion began to work with the engineers to get across the Busu at a place where the river separated into 3 channels, around 20, 30, and 14 meters wide. Their currents ran around 25 kilometers per hour with a depth of over 2 meters. With all of the rain, it became apparent the crossings were going to be pretty much impossible with the materials on hand. Nonetheless, when there is a will, well, there is a way. Warrant Officer Bill McCallum and 2 engineers swam the river with signal wires and managed to drag a rope across, securing it to the western bank. However, when they began hooking boats to the rope, they soon became swamped, ruining the entire ordeal. Further north, the 2 and 4th Independent Company managed to bridge across the Sanquep River, which lay on the junction of the Busu. They soon established an ambush position on the east bank of the Busu River near the Kunda Bridge. It was at this point General Herring decided to reinforce Wootton with Brigadier Cedric Edgar's 4th Brigade, consisting of the 22nd, 2946, and the 37 52nd Battalions. They would take over the beachhead areas after landings were made. They departed Milne Bay in 6 LSTs and 6 LSIs on September the 9th, successfully landing at Red Beach by the night of the 10th. Meanwhile, to the north, the 2 and 25th Battalion had reached Jensen's Plantation, where they were fired upon for the very first time. The Australians had taken over 5 days from capturing Nadzab to contact Japanese positions west of Lae, and the delay unnerved the Japanese commanders. General Yoshihara would write, "The movement of the units which had dropped on Nadzab were very sluggish. If they had attacked with their vast strength, it would have been the hour of death of Lae in a matter of a few hours. It was a piece of good luck in the midst of misfortune." The command, although unable to understand the reason, was given time to bring troops across from Lae and Salamaua to defend the western approaches of Lae. Thus, the Japanese had been given a minor window to retreat some of their forces from Salamaua to Lae. Back over at Salamaua, the heavy rains continued to mask the Japanese retreat across the Francisco River, while simultaneously hindering the Australians from crossing it. Brigadier Monaghan's men managed to reach Scout Hill. The 15th Battalion began their pursuit of the enemy going north and east of Scout Ridge on the 10th. In their rapid advance, they managed to kill a few stragglers and secured some high ground overlooking the mouth of the Francisco River. Patrols southwest of Nuknuk, and I can't get used to saying that one, linked up with the 42nd Battalion. North of the Francisco River, Brigadier Hammer began testing enemy defenses at Rough Hill. Captain Jago's C Company of the 58th 59th tossed 3 platoons at Rough Hill: Bob Lane's 7th, Ted Griff's 8th, and Arthur O'Rourke's 9th. Each made their way up the hill around 50 to 100 yards before being fired upon and forced to pull out. After this, Lewin's platoon from the 2 and 3rd Independent Company fought its way up Savage Spur, where they too faced heavy fire and had to pull out. They gradually managed to capture Savage Spur, leading to an encirclement of the position. Meanwhile, the 2 and 7th Battalion, along with 3 other companies of the 58th 59th and 2 independent company platoons, moved up Sandy Creek. The Japanese launched a counterattack, dislodging units from the outskirts of Rough Hill and Arnold's Crest, preparing for a final withdrawal that was set to begin the following night. Thus, when the Australians launched their attack the next day, they would find an abandoned Rough Hill. A bit to the south, C Company of the 15th Battalion crossed the overflowing Francisco River near its mouth to dominate the isthmus. Davidson's B Company crossed the Francisco River in the morning and advanced northeast across the Salamua airfield without opposition, quickly capturing Logie 1. As the Australians entered Salamaua, it appeared to them like a shell. The Allied bombing campaigns against Salamua had been devastating. One private, Ted Griff, would write this: "The isthmus was lined with bomb craters." Private Peter Hemery wrote, "Not a building is left standing, just an occasional heap of scattered wreckage." Private Jack Glynn wrote, "Salamaua was a shambles. A building wasn't left standing. By the look of the place, it was a very good bombing." The bombings had killed an estimated 200 to 300 Japanese in Salamaua. Many were left unburied, leaving a terrible, nauseating stench in the air. A great quantity of supplies were discarded or destroyed. 2 cargo ships laid offshore, and further down the beach were numerous wrecked barges. The aircraft hangars had roughly 40 damaged aircraft, and it looked obvious the airfield had not been used since the 9th Division had landed. To be blunt, most of the Japanese stationed there were relieved to depart it. In the end, it was Monaghan who won the race. Over to the west, after crossing the river, the 47th Battalion advanced unopposed and converged with Hammer's forces. They soon captured Arnold's Crest, Edward's Spur, and launched their first attacks against Keller Ridge, known as the Hand. The Japanese had concentrated at Malolo, where they were evacuating by barge towards Lae on the night of September the 11th. To cover them, General Nakano ordered units from the 80th and 238th Regiments to defend a last line that ran from the Keller Ridge all the way to Malolo. Wooten brought up 14 25-pounders to support the advance. Australian forces, now past the Busa River, began to unleash hell with their artillery. The Japanese commanders at Lae believed the artillery spelt their doom. Meanwhile, the 224th Battalion had unsuccessfully tried to bridge the Busa River using some felled logs supported by stone pylons. The men tried to build the bridge, placing the felled logs around the large stone pylons, and were initially successful when it was just at a 20-meter stream. However, during the night, the river rose and the logs went up with them. The current was so strong, the logs that did not rise because they were stuck with the stone pylons just snapped in two. The men had to abandon the attempt in the end. Lieutenant Evans was forced to strip the 243rd Battalion of their weapons and ferried them over the Busa River during the afternoon by rope. Eventually, Evans managed to arrange a deal with some American boatmen to lend him an LCVP for a few trips, which allowed for his 228th fully equipped to get over. Logistics. The 228th managed to create a bridgehead with a sigh of relief, I would imagine. To the north, the 25-pounders were gradually moving closer to hit Lae more accurately. The 225th Battalion ran into 200 men of the 15th Independent Engineer Regiment, who had the unfortunate task of delaying them. The Japanese defensive positions were strung out back along the road behind Whittaker's Bridge and strong points north of the Lae airfield, known as the Heaths, Edwards, and Jacobson's plantations. 30 of them were killed outright as they withdrew past Heath's plantation. The 2 and 33rd Battalion and the 2 and 2nd Pioneer Battalion advanced towards Markham Point. C Company of the 24th Battalion launched an attack beginning by lobbing 126 mortar bombs and 8 rounds of smoke at a point called River Ambush. As the mortar fire ceased, the leading platoon surged forward, but the Japanese defenders advanced past the smoke and quickly repulsed the incoming attackers. The next day, the 2 and 31st Battalion arrived to the scene, and they joined the 2 and 25th Battalion to clear Jenny's plantation. They encountered some heavy resistance further down the road at a bridge near Whittaker's plantation. The 24th Battalion made another attempt against Markham Point on the 12th. 4 platoons hit some southern pillboxes, but they were repulsed quite quickly. Lieutenant Richards went on the record to say that a further ground attack without support will not be successful. An application has again been made for a synchronized air and artillery attack. Over at the coast, the 2 and 32nd and the 2 and 43rd Battalions had just arrived, and Evans directed the 2 and 28th to continue the advance towards Malahang, while the 2 and 43rd would hit New and Old Yanga. Captain Catchlove's company patrolled towards New Yanga, while Captain Gordon's company patrolled towards Old Yanga. During the morning, both skirmished and dispersed enemy patrols. Then at 2:30 p.m., it was reported that New Yanga looked abandoned. At 3:35, Kachalev was organizing an assault against the outskirts of Nyanga when suddenly heavy fire came from the direction of a hut. The Australians were surprised by this, but quickly called in some artillery support from the 14 25-pounders brought up from Red Beach, alongside more mortars. They hit Nyanga with 525 shells as the infantry tried to storm in, but they were met with heavy casualties. They attempted a second assault during the afternoon, but again the Japanese held them back. Back over at the Salawa area, the Japanese continued their frantic withdrawal as the 5th Division began mop-up operations. Patrols combed the peninsula finding 2 naval and 2 anti-aircraft guns, large quantities of unused arms, medical supplies, some wireless transceivers, and a portable generator. The Japanese HQ was a well-furnished hut. Allies found food still on the table, indicating it was a rushed withdrawal. The Japanese had built several camps on the water's edge and inside cave networks. Some patrols found female clothing, lipstick, and powder, indicating the presence of women, and I think you can imagine what they were. The infamous comfort women of the Japanese during World War II. The 42nd Battalion would manage to occupy Kayla Point. One of Major Wharf's patrols reached the coast halfway between Kayla Point and Mission Point, and the 2 and 7th Battalion would capture the now abandoned Kidney Hill before continuing forwards towards Malolo. The Japanese at Kilo Ridge continued to fire back upon the enemy, performing a bitter fighting withdrawal, until their final evacuation by barge on September the 13th. By the 13th, the bulk of General Nakano's 51st Division had reached Lae, and they were now preparing to withdraw even further to the Kiriasio area. Nakano had devised 2 plans to withdraw the Lae garrison. One plan was to go across the Sarawag Range to the north coast. The other was to go over the foothills of the Finestri Ranges, heading west parallel to the Markham Valley. Engineering officer Kitamoto Masamichi, who knew about both routes, was asked to give his opinion on it, and he recalled, "It was a responsibility too heavy for just a lieutenant to decide. I thought, but well aware that Allied aircraft could easily interdict the route through the open kunai of the Markham Valley foothills. The second plan is impossible. The first plan is difficult, but there is some chances of success. I would choose plan 1. However, the sacrifice will be great. We should ready our packs as we would retreat over the mountains from the 10th to the 15th of September. General Nakano agreed, and he issued the withdrawal orders, which went out to all units on September the 8th. Beginning on the 12th, the 7th Base Force main units consisting of Admiral Mori's men began their withdrawal. The original plan called for them to cross the Busu River at the Kunda Bridge, then to travel via Gawan and Bungalumba to the summit of the Sarawaj Range. However, the Kunda Bridge was being blocked by Australian commandos, so they would need to find another way across the Busu, then on to Bona while fighting the enemy back. Engineers of the 51st and 30th Engineer Regiments were sent first to construct and repair the road to Mount Sarawagat. Colonel Ataki commanded the second group coming over from Edwards Plantation, consisting of the 51st Divisional HQ, the 66th Regiment, the 3rd Battalion of the 21st Regiment, the 1st Battalion of the 80th Regiment, and the bulk of the 14th Field Artillery Regiment. The last group, who would act as a rearguard, were the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 115th Regiment coming from Malahang and the Busu, the 15th Independent Engineer Regiment, and the 1st Battalion of the 11th Regiment coming from Whittaker, Heath's, Edwards, and Jackson's plantations as well. Admiral Mori's men were ambushed from the very start by an American patrol of the 1st Battalion 503rd Parachute Regiment due east of Nadzab. This forced them to divert into the jungle towards Yalu. Over at the Lae Field Hospital were patients who were unable to be evacuated via submarine, nor was it possible for them to be carried across the mountains, so they volunteered to protect the division's rear. Meanwhile, Salamaua was assumed to be destined to become a large Allied base. When General Herring arrived at Milford's HQ on September the 14th, he took one look at the insanitary shell of what was Salamaua town, its poor airfield, and the nearby swamp. He immediately wiped it as a base. It was to be discarded to ruin. Some Americans camped nearby would actually call it a, quote, filthy, rat-ridden, pestilential hole. Perhaps a lackluster jewel after fighting bitter months for it. The Salamaua campaign was officially over. The 15th Battalion charged up the coast, chasing after the Japanese, catching some south of the Markham River. The campaign was a brutal one. The 17th Brigade reported 135 killed, 354 wounded. The 15th Brigade reported 124 killed and 346 wounded. The 162nd Regiment reported 81 killed and 396 wounded, and the 29th Brigade reported 76 killed and 155 wounded. Against them, Nakano's 51st Division suffered an estimated 2,200 casualties since the end of July, for a total of over 8,000 casualties, including 2,722 killed in the entire campaign. Back over at Lae, the evacuation saw standard infantry equipment being carried at about 120 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades, and provisions for 10 days per man. Infantrymen had to carry their machine guns, small mortars, while artillery units had to carry their 75mm mountain guns and machine cannon companies their 20mm guns. With supplies no longer being sent to the Salamaua front, there were provisions available for the withdrawal of Lae. General Yoshihara would write later that the generally healthy men of the Lae-based naval forces were able to carry enough provisions for 14 to 15 days, but the IJA units, most of whom had been fighting for Salamaua for months, were in extreme exhaustion and only able to carry about half the amount. Over to the east, the 224th Battalion on September the 13th began constructing a box girder bridge over the Busu River. It was launched after midday under heavy enemy fire. When it nearly got across the gap, it overbalanced and was swept away downstream. Later in the afternoon, more box girders were brought over. A 25-meter single-box girder bridge was assembled using 3 box and 2 hornbeam sections. 100 men picked up the bridge and carried it through the water over a meter deep across the first 20-meter channel to a mid-river island. However, they had no beachhead, thus on the far bank only mortar barrage could keep the enemy at bay. They began to doubt the crossing would ever be made, so Whitehead, on the 13th, asked Wooten permission to send 120 men over the Busu River at its mouth to advance north to the other side where the 224th Battalion were. An hour later, Lieutenant Colonel Ainsley of the 248th Brigade crossed and began advancing north, but the jungle proved quite difficult and communications were pretty bad. Further north, the 2 and 4th Independent Company tried to cross the river, but the Japanese held them at bay. The men were led by Lieutenant Staples. As they forded the river, he was wounded by Japanese sniper fire. The remainder of his section were swept off their feet and scattered along the bank of the river. This prompted other men to try and use the Kunda Bridge. The Japanese employed a trick often used against them. They allowed a bunch of the men to cross the bridge before they unleashed their guns. 7 men were cut to ribbons. Many others became marooned on the wrong side. In a desperate situation, one Private Jagger charged and attacked 2 enemy machine gun nests and a motor post, killing several Japanese and capturing a ton of equipment. Jagger then waited for darkness before swimming back. The platoon that had gone over had lost 7 men, with several more wounded. Along the coast, the 2 and 43rd found New Yanga unoccupied, while the 2 and 28th encountered stiff resistance at Malahang. Lieutenant Connor's platoon were advancing at 11:20 a.m. when they ran into the enemy, who were entrenched at a track junction 1,000 yards east of Malahang Anchorage. Connor went ahead with Corporal Torrent to charge 3 foxholes where 6 Japanese, including an officer, were killed. Connor was killed, so Torrent took command and he ordered the advance at 3:30 p.m., where they would find Japanese abandoned positions. The defenders were hitting the men as hard as they could. Artillery Commander Lieutenant Colonel Suganobu Watanabe believed that the artillery troops were of no more use. If they could not fire a shot on the battlefield, that is. Thus, for his tired and weakened unit, they must carry 1 cannon. It would be good enough, but they must also carry some shells. In the end, his men sacrificed carrying sufficient food rations as he led them up the Sarawag mountain, carrying the mountain gun components they had, weighing up to 50 kilograms each. Meanwhile, Hiromatsu Seito's anti-aircraft unit abandoned their guns in the Atsura range in order to carry additional food. Sato and his men had enough food for about 4 days, and they were told it could take up to 20 days to reach the northern coast. We were stricken with apprehension. The effect of salt worked wondrously. Those of us without salt became weakened. I used my salt sparingly, and I never drank unboiled water. Back over to the west, Brigadier Ether ordered the 2 and 25th to put pressure on Whittaker's plantation, while the 2 and 33rd moved around south to establish a roadblock at Heath's plantation. Artillery and motor fire began the offensive, as Major Robertson's company of the 2 and 25th captured the bridge at Whittaker's plantation, while Captain Gow and Captain Butler's companies advanced towards Heath's plantation. There was a fierce battle, but a single platoon managed to overrun the enemy HQ on the northern sector of Heath's plantation. Meanwhile, 2 patrols advanced west and southwest, converging towards Heath's plantation only to find it abandoned. Thus, the 2 and 33rd occupied Heath's plantation without a fight in the end. During the night, the Japanese had evacuated Whittaker's plantation, and the second echelon of forces had successfully departed Lae to march north to the Butibum rivers and then towards Bona. At 5 p.m. on the 14th, Ether learned from his divisional HQ that one of the documents captured by the 2 and 25th the previous day indicated the Japanese operation order, dated for September the 8th. It showcased the evacuation of Lae, which was of great excitement for General Vasey when he found out. Now every member of the division sought to race the 9th Division to Lae, also hoping to prevent as many of the enemy from escaping as possible. Vasey's staff concluded the Japanese were already withdrawing up the Busa River. Thus, Vasey believed that it would not be a good idea to weaken Ether's assault on what he now realized were just stubborn Japanese rearguards, remembering how brutal the Japanese rearguards were in the Papuan campaigns. So he ordered the 25th Brigade to push vigorously towards Lae. Ether elected to quickly seize Edward's plantation. On September the 14th, Ether's forces drove the Japanese from their positions at Lane's Bridge and continued to pursue them in the direction of Edward's plantation. Over to the east, Whitehead's engineers were at last able to create a bridge over the third channel, allowing Captain McNamara's company of the 2 and 24th to get across. The Japanese were surprised by this, and they began to unleash as much fire as they could on the newly established bridgehead. But Whitehead quickly sent another company, led by Captain Finlay, to support the bridgehead, successfully fighting the Japanese off for 4 hours of combat. The rest of the battalion crossed afterwards, uncontested, then the 2 and 23rd and the 2 and 48th. Along the coast, Evans' 24th Brigade advanced against harsh Japanese resistance. Evans received word the 2 and 43rd were approaching Wagon from the north, so he sent the 2 and 32nd Battalion to hit Wagon from the south. Lieutenant Day was leading a platoon around the right flank when he began to get sniped from treetop Japanese. Day's platoon suffered heavy casualties, and he himself took a shot right through his spine. He was dragged away by Warrant Officer Dalziel, but Dalziel was shot dead in the process. Day was then killed by a grenade, prompting Sergeant McCallum to take over, who advised the situation was quite warm and required some motor support. The men backed up to give some room for the motors to fire off, and at 4:15, 12 3-inches and 10 2-inch motors began lobbing. This time, a few platoons with machine gun crew support made a frontal attack with others hitting the flanks. They were met with heavy fire back at 30 yards or so and suffered 6 more casualties. The Japanese began to waver as the platoons continued their assault, and it soon became a full flight towards the village. As the platoons charged, many mopped up the snipers and apparently some fowls, who would be destined for the night's dinner. The 2 and 32nd captured Wagon Village by dusk, while the 2 and 28th advanced towards Malahang Anchorage. The men began infiltrating a road behind a Japanese position. At 9:15 a.m., they unleashed an attack, killing 12 Japanese without any loss, and at 12:40 p.m. killed another 14. A Company found 2 abandoned 75mm dual-purpose guns north of the anchorage during the afternoon patrol. A few patrols went further north of the anchorage, circling around establishing positions that would seal the anchorage's fate. Wooten ordered the 2 and 24th to recross the river and reinforce the Kunda Bridge, while Vasey earmarked Brigadier Doherty's 21st Brigade to advance upon the Bona. On September the 15th, Whitehead was finally able to launch his main offensive, tossing the 2 and 23rd Battalion against Kamkaman and the 2 and 48th Battalion at Malahang Airfield. A bit to the south, the 2 and 32nd were capturing Malahang Mission, and the 2 and 43rd were just entering Wagon Village. To the west, Ether's men were facing strong resistance from the Japanese rearguards over at Edwards Plantation. The 2 and 33rd were performing a frontal assault, trying to draw the enemy attention, while the 2 and 31st moved around the right flank to secure some high ground behind the Edwards Plantation. Despite their resilience, Edwards Plantation was completely surrounded. By the late afternoon, the Japanese were forced to make a break for it, heading north of Edwards Bridge, thus completely abandoning Lae to its fate. As they fled for their lives, 64 Japanese would be cut down by machine gun fire, trying desperately to climb a spur, being pursued by Ether's men. Along the coast, the 2 and 28th were moving through Malahang Anchorage, with just a few skirmishes occurring. Both divisions raced to be the first to enter Lae. General Nakano's 8,650 men, including 2,500 naval personnel, had managed to get out, heading north towards the Busu River. Southeast of Yalu, Admiral Mori's 1st Echelon were intercepted by the 3rd Battalion, 503rd Parachute Regiment. The paratroopers clashed with a vanguard of 34 men, forcing the rest to head northwest across the Adzara Range. Despite being closer to Lae, Wu'un's men halted their advance at the Bumbi River by midday on September the 16th. Ether, however, considered his advance was not speedy enough. Therefore, he urged the leading company to hasten. And in the words of Captain Butler, "Up at daylight and off again. C Company leading the brigade this time. Men are a bit nervous, again, and went pretty steadily. Sick Japs along the track kept holding things up, and we expected to run into something at any moment. Then along the track and into the middle of us came a jeep crowded with a brigade HQ. Past me and up to the leading platoon. The old brig jumped out and started urging the troops to hurry along. The troops weren't very impressed, as they thought the Jap was in front. Finally, the brigadier, armed with a pistol, acting as a leading scout, and the troops followed in a column of route behind. A brigadier is not an ideal section leader, though. The whole reason for his action was that he wanted the brigade to be the first onto the beach. He managed it okay. I had to send a patrol down the beach and back so we would have the honor. Doubtful one, as there were no Japs. Unfortunately, we advanced too quickly due to no opposition, and the Yanks came over and strafed us." Ether's men took Jacobson's plantation without opposition. Then a patrol reached Lae's Voco Point at 11:30. Not knowing Vasey had won the race, Wu'un launched a final attack, preceded by an aerial strike and an artillery barrage after midday. They actually mistook the 2 and 25th to be the Japanese, almost leading to calamity. But Wu'un stopped his artillery quickly when this became apparent. Both divisions finally entered Lae, ending the Lae-Salamaua campaign. Operation Postern was a success, though they were unable to prevent the Japanese from evacuating Lae. The overriding failure on the Allied side was due to an underestimation of the enemy. There had been an overriding assumption that the Japanese forces at Lae would fight to the death to hold it. Back on September the 8th, General MacArthur, 'cause I have to say something, don't you? Well, he put out a triumphant communique, claiming that they had enveloped 20,000 Japanese. Wu'un's staff estimated that there had been around 8,240 Japanese at Lae and 6,934 at Salamaua. Vasey's staff thought it was 6,420 at Lae and about 7,041 at Salamaua. In truth, Nakano had roughly 11,000 men, and the majority got away, about 8,000 of them. It was a considerable feat. The Japanese had inflicted 150 deaths and 397 wounded on the 9th Division, and 38 deaths and 104 wounded upon the 7th Division. Wu'un would write later about seeing Lae. "It was in an indescribably filthy condition, and had been very thoroughly wrecked. Vast dumps of stores and discarded weapons littered the area. The airfield had not been used since before the landings, it seemed. The hangars were wrecked, and about 40 damaged planes were mute witnesses to the power of the Allied Air Force. The typical nauseating stench of an area occupied by the Japanese army pervaded Lae as it had Salamaua 6 days before. Lae would become a major forward base of operations, as Buna had become earlier. Another stepping stone to Tokyo." I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I'm just releasing a historic film review on the Oppenheimer film. You can also check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for exclusive podcasts. This month's podcast is going to be a piece on Tomoyuki Yamashita and how he became the Tiger of Malaya. Check it out, it means a lot to me. And thus ends the Salamaua Lae campaign. The deceptive strategy to pressure Salamaua to entice the enemy to loosen its grip on Lae resulted in both bases being overrun in a very dramatic fashion. Now the Allies had a major forward base of operations to continue the push north.